Let me just start by thanking everyone for coming. This is just such an incredible event, getting everyone together and all of us together this weekend. Why don't we just start by going around the table, if you would just tell us your name. If you want to admit when you were born, that would be great.
Yes.
Where you're from, and what your relationship is to Shmuel Yankel and Elka Razel.
I'm Ronald Goldstein, Ron Goldstein, or Ronnie Goldstein, depending on who that person is. And I'm the son of Irving and Helen, which was one of the sons, I guess the oldest son of Shmuel, not Shmuel Yankel, but Avram Meir, who was the son of Shmuel Yankel. I was born November the 1st, 1933, which makes me 74 this year. Big one coming up. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia Baptist Hospital.
I'm Elliott Levitas. I'm the son of Louis and Ida, and she, of course, daughter of Shmuel Yankel and Elka Razel. I was born in Atlanta on December 26, 1930, and I sort of grew up in the shadows of Shmuel Yankel. Elka Razel is the person I'm named for, so she had predeceased.
And where were you? What part of town did you grow up in?
We grew up on the north side of Atlanta, and that becomes significant because at that time a large part of the Jewish community, including the synagogues, were on the south side. And I think one of the, and that's significant in another way because my mother, Ida, never learned how to drive. And yet her two major responsibilities were to take care of Louis and Shmuel Yankel. And she used to take a streetcar from the north side of town to the south side of town in order to be able to do what she needed to do for Shmuel Yankel. So as years passed and the Jewish community began to migrate to the north side of Atlanta, things of course changed, and the old home on Washington Street became second base in the Atlanta Braves Stadium.
I'm Rita Atlas Goldstein, now Rita Wolfson. I was born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, and I came to it.
month?
What, August the 16th, 1926. I'm 81, I'll be 82 years old very soon, and I've been told it's just a number, and I believe that. I had the extreme privilege and good fortune and wonderful experience to have met Marvin Goldstein back in 1954. Married him and moved to Atlanta in 1956, and began the most extremely dedicated adventure in living that I've ever had, or anybody could ever have. And have lived in Atlanta for over 50 some odd years and feel it's really my home and feel that my roots are still there. And became part of this illustrious Goldstein clan, and have never looked back on it without just pleasure and fond memories, and just look forward to sharing a lot of it with everybody today.
I'm Stanley Cavell. I won't go into why. I was born Stanley Goldstein in 1926 in September, Grandma.
Oh my.
On the south side of Atlanta, a mile away from Zadie's, Shmuel Yankel's house. I walked it once only with my father on a Sunday, not because we had to. I grew up in a large family of my mother's. I think they had all bound together in a small house on the south side because it was quickly became the Depression. And by that, my Siegel family. Grandmother was still alive. She was widowed. I don't know what my home is. I write quite a lot, and I think it's all about trying to figure out what my home is. Though born in Atlanta and lived here for 8 years, the next years were divided fairly evenly, the next 8, between Atlanta and Sacramento. Last night at a wonderful occasion, dinner, it was said that there was a California branch and an Atlanta branch of the Goldstein family. And when it was called for that the Sacramento, the California branch, stand up, I got half up and didn't know whether I was supposed to stand up or not. So I can't exactly say that we bridged it, these two coasts, but sometimes it felt that way. Why we kept moving back and forth is also a story partly about the Depression, but not exactly. I'll say a little something about that tonight. Why my father had to keep looking for a business and a place to work and make a living for his family. He is the youngest son of the 7 Goldstein children who came to this country in roughly 4 or 5, 1904 or 5. That's just part of the history that even then, that's fairly close years, are vague to me. But he is, but while the youngest son, he's still older than the 2 sisters who came, Ida and Rose only. I think that's enough to begin with.
I'm Ted Levitas, son of Ida and Louis, affectionately known by a lot of people as LJ. And I was born on April the 9th, 1924 at Georgia Baptist Hospital. We lived, as my brother Elliott pointed out, on the north side, which was somewhat of an anomaly in the Jewish community at that time. Even though my mother's attachment was still to the south side, aside from the commitment to having to take care of my grandfather, Schwartz, and his house, which was a big and lovely and wonderful house. She worked at the Jewish Educational Alliance, which was the forerunner of the Atlanta Jewish Community Center. And I will say one thing that Stanley may or may not recall, but Stanley, as some of you probably know, is an accomplished musician in addition to everything else that he's accomplished at. His mother was also a very well-known pianist and musician in her own right, and had many recognition opportunities while they lived in Atlanta off and on. At one time, Stanley lived down the street from us off of Park Drive. But the significant thing about this is that, and Stanley may not remember this, they had a magnificent piano which traveled as many times as they moved to Sacramento as it did when they moved back to Atlanta. And in between times, it was stored lovingly in our family room on Park Drive.
No,
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Well, I'm just bringing you up
I know
to
where
date.
that piano is now.
Yeah, I know that.
Where is it now?
In our house.
I took piano lessons on that piano.
That's right.
I'm very moved to hear
There
that.
you go.
Well, you can come up and play at any time. It's right there.
My harmonica.
It was a great relationship that we had with all the members of the family, and it'll be interesting to hear what everyone has to say.
I should say that, well, I didn't mention, I don't even know if I mentioned my mother, who's the primary ingredient of my life. But if I didn't, it's because tonight when I talk about photo, I'll talk quite a lot about her. I mean, most of it about her. So I didn't want to speak from a script, so to speak, in introducing myself.
I will interject one other thing. Aunt Fanny had different obligations in the music world in Atlanta. I think she played piano at WSB Radio at one
for
time.
years, yeah.
But we also had in Atlanta a burlesque theater adjacent, across the street from the present Hurt building in downtown Atlanta. It's like a little alley street, actually. And Stanley and I had the privilege of seeing our first burlesque from behind the curtains in the corner when she snuck us in one afternoon, which was Old hat to both of us.
Oh, exactly, yes, men of the world.
I think it corrupted both of you.
No, it enlightened us. It
Oh,
made
that
us
was
what we
it.
are today.
That was the
A
low
little
point
raunchy.
of her life. But if there was one job in Atlanta for a piano player, she had it.
That's right.
And this was the depth of the Depression when
Yeah.
we were talking about. And that
That's
was
right.
it.
That's right.
There was no radio station then that was functioning and so forth.
Yeah.
That's right. Oh, Fanny is her Atlanta name and the name that she was born with. Nikki
Nikki.
is her California name.
Yeah.
Did she play the organ at the Fox Theater?
Yes, she did indeed.
She
Really?
did. She played the organ at the Fox Theater.
Yeah.
I remember someone told me that.
Yeah, that's right. She had to go practice the pedals and figure out how to do that. But there was,
I never knew.
as Ted says, there's nothing in music she wouldn't try to do anyway.
I'm Cissie Goldstein. I don't know if you can all hear me.
Yes.
Can you?
Okay.
Okay. I married Danny back in '58. And he lived until 3 years ago. But I had all the advantages that a bride could have marrying him. And the 54 years that we were married, he was wonderful. Danny always talked about Atlanta, but we never went in the very beginning. He was too busy with the store, and we were too busy doing our thing. And finally, after a few years, Aunt Ida said to him, I think it's time you bring your wife back. We want to meet her. So Danny said, you want to go? And I said, sure. I knew a lot about the family from pictures. So when I got back there, it was somebody's bar mitzvah that Aunt Ida insisted we come to. I can't tell you which one because there were so many kids and so much going on. And when we got there, I started meeting all of the family, and she bawled me out. She said, you were going to come a week ago, and I told your husband, if you came a week earlier, I won't talk to you. Because the bar mitzvah is a week later. So we had to change all our arrangements, and I thought, boy, that must be something. Before I go further, I'll just tell you, when I was engaged to Danny, I was on the phone with a woman who was my dressmaker. And she said to me, the fellow you're marrying, where is he from? And I said, Atlanta. She says, Atlanta? Does your husband know anyone by the name of Aunt Fanny? Not Fanny. Aunt Ida? And I said, yes. In fact, I'll show you a picture of her. She says, you don't have to. I've known her for 100 years. She's not Jewish, but she worked at the Alliance. Is that where she?
Yeah.
And when she worked there, this woman knew her very, very well. So that was a laugh in itself. Then we went further, and my family came out to meet Danny when we decided to get engaged. And my stepfather said, you know, I'm from Atlanta. And he said, what was your name? He said, the same as it is now, Kalech, K-A-L-E-C-H. No one knew that name but Aunt Ida. She went back through the calendar and through the mission information, and she got out who he was. And she called me one day and said, you had a nice family. That was the second husband of my mother's. And then we went on to pictures. I have the picture that you had last night on the table. I have that from you.
I sent it to you, yes.
And with it, you sent me the name of everybody
Yes, yes.
that's on it.
Mhm.
And that picture has Marvin on it.
Well, that's a whole story in
Yeah,
itself.
That's what I understand.
It was a birthday surprise to him because he wasn't there, and he said, I'd love to. I should have been there, and I wasn't there. So I went to a lot of trouble to make sure that he was the right age. He was 14, and I had it digital in, and it was very, very difficult to do, but I put him in that picture because that's what he wanted.
What was the occasion for that affair?
You mean that family picture?
Yeah.
I don't really know. It was, I don't know what the occasion was.
That's what someone asked me, and I said, I have no idea.
I mean, Elliott, you
Well,
were
Elliott
just
would
about
know.
3.
I would know, I was
Yeah, but
there.
She was there. He was
You were,
there.
you were a couple years old, weren't you?
Yeah, I
He was in
my
his mother's arms.
Your mother's
9
arms,
months
right.
old.
So you
It was
don't
just-
remember.
Does anyone remember or know how the family came to Atlanta in the first place? What
Good
what
question.
prompted them to come and why Atlanta and when they came and that sort of thing? Does anyone have any memories or stories about that?
My guess, unless you know something different, is that there were relatives already
That's right.
living in
That's my
Atlanta.
memory.
And I don't know the name Cott. I've heard that so many times recently, but I do know the name Golden, and that we do have a relationship with a Golden family.
That's true.
And it's my understanding that they were in Atlanta significantly before Schwartz and his family came there.
That was Ben Golden's side of the
That
family.
was Ben and Aaron Golden and Shimon Goldens and Edith Dubrow, who was a cousin she had married, and they were there. And I think that there was must have been some tie-in, some connection that brought them there. So
Didn't Opera Mayor come before Schmulyankel? Wasn't he
No.
in Atlanta?
I don't
No, actually, Charles was the first one of the family to come over, of the Schmulyankel sons.
Schmulyankel's
He
brother.
came over in the 80s.
This is Schmulyankel's.
Brother. And Charles was the first one. Actually, there's two conflicting stories. Supposedly, he came over with Schmulyankel, and there's another story where he came later. But Charles first went to New York and went into business with 2 other fellows. And one of them was named Goldstein, and he took that name later on. But it was Cavalierski when he came over. And he actually went in business in New York and then went to Galveston. So how they got to Atlanta is something else, and I think you're probably right. There had to be a relative here before then. We're still searching for that answer.
I know that there's a relationship with the Golden family.
Yes.
And exactly how that came about or what the branches are that extended that way, I've never been able to figure out.
I have that.
But I know
Has
that,
anyone ever asked that the Golden
Well,
family?
We're in the process of
yeah,
doing it.
but there are limited people in that family now who would have any knowledge whatsoever about what went on.
You mentioned Edith and Shimon
And Aaron,
and Aaron. I got the idea that they came over later than Schmulyankel and our mother. Because I remember Shimon, for example, speaking French.
well, he was in the French, he lived in France, and he didn't come when Aaron and Edith came over. They came before him, and then Shimon came over a number of years later, and always spoke with a French accent, and never married either. He was neither Aaron nor he married, and he was very devoted to my mother and was very affectionate with our children and parts of his new family, so to speak. But I think you're right about that. They did come later.
Was there any sense of why they left Europe and came here? I mean, was it the classic tale of economic improvement? Does anybody have any stories or memories or ideas about why the family left in the first
More
place?
specifically than that, there was a pogrom. It's still classical, but in addition to that, and I had heard that we had an aunt who was bayoneted by a Cossack. That's something my father dropped. He was, to get an oral history from any of, certainly from my father, was out of the question. But if you listened and hung around enough, you had threads to try to weave together. And that was one I heard that very early, very vivid.
Well, I had heard about the pogrom too, but one thing I find interesting in the discussion is we are really interested to find out what went on over there.
Indeed.
The reason we never talked about it is they didn't want
They
to talk
didn't wanna
about it.
talk about it.
It was good riddance as far as they were
That's right. I
concerned.
agree
They
with
got
you.
away, and they didn't want to talk about what.
Who was bayoneted?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
That's right.
It was almost like Holocaust survivors.
Yeah, that's the
You
sort
know,
of.
very much
It's
Can you,
Same.
can somebody give a date for when they arrived?
The best we have is 1980s. It wasn't an
No,
exact
1880s.
1880s, yeah,
But
1980s.
Schwartz
but not
wasn't here.
Schwartz.
His family wasn't here in
No.
the 80s.
No, Charles came over
Oh.
in the
So
1880s.
I really am talking about,
Well, most
Lady
of our
Goldstein.
people came over early 1900s,
Yeah.
That's what I
1906.
guessed.
But the point was, in Zubladova, where the Shmulyanka was from, about 68% of the population was Jewish
Right.
during that time. So I don't know what could have been, although the economic situation wasn't good there. And that's basically the reason
But-
I see.
That village, you pronounced it Sudabova,
Zubladova is the way the
Zubladova.
Polish people say it, Zubladova.
but as I understand it, that was sort of like a Jewish suburb of a very large industrial system. Bialystok.
Right.
Yes.
And so in that community, and I don't even have an idea how large it was, but I guess the sense that it was sort of a small community.
It was.
And so the fact that they had a lot of Jews in that little town didn't shield them from the type of anti-Semitism that would have been pervasive in Poland at that time, in places like Bialystok.
Could be.
Well, we don't really know, for example, how our father got to Dublin, Ireland. Our grandparents on that side are buried in Dublin, Ireland at this time. And there's a story that perhaps is apocryphal, and it may be, if that's as good a reason as any to tell the story, is that they left Riga and they got on a boat somewhere and went across, and they were going to New York. That's where, so ostensibly, they paid their fare to get to New York. And they sailed, and they sailed, and they sailed, and one day the ship docked, and the captain said in a deep voice, "Cork!" And everybody thought he said, "York!" And it was Cork, and it wasn't York, and they all landed in Ireland. Now, that's about as good a story as we know about it, and it may have no, I'm not even going to say that. I think it's a good story. So, but that's as far as we know. And there's been a significant Jewish community over there, and they're in Atlanta. There are a number of Jewish families who have relatives in Ireland. So that we don't know how they got out of the countries, where did they get money for boat fare, how did they make these journeys, and in Shmulyanka's family, so many people to have to bring over. So it probably will forever be somewhat of a mystery exactly what prompted them to be smart enough to make a move, and that's really what it boiled down to.
I think anti-Semitism played a big role in most of the mass refugees that they came over during that, when the pogroms were taking place. It was impossible to live in those conditions.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Alka-Razel, because I know that Ted, you were around 4 years old, I think, when she died.
Right.
I'm sure that there was a lot of talk of her. Even when I did an interview with my grandmother Ida, she referred to her as Elke de Schrijbeke, that she
Right.
was the writer, and I want you to talk about that. But since you're the person, I think, who would have had firsthand experience or knowledge or memory of her, if you could talk a little bit about anything you remember, and then anyone else, stories that were told to you about her and her relationship to Shmulyankel and to the family. But Ted,
Well, she was, as my mother did refer to her as the Schrijbeke, she was the enlightened person. She had some level of education, and we don't know how far that actually went, but she knew English, she knew Yiddish, and could read letters from the old country to families who were now living in Atlanta, and in turn could write letters to send back to them. So that was her connection with the other Jewish members of the European community who had come into the Atlanta area, as best we know. As a 4-year-old, I remember her as an elegant-looking woman. She died needlessly because in those days they didn't have the medication for what they called blood poisoning. She'd cut a finger, as the story goes, in the kitchen, and it became infected, and that was it. And there was nothing they could do. And I remember we would go there occasionally, even while she was ill, for Friday night dinner, and I would have to run upstairs to tell her to listen out when we made kiddish so she could say amen. And that was, I remember the bedroom that she was in. I do picture that very clearly. I think there were 6 bedrooms on the upstairs of that house. It was quite large. And she was undoubtedly a lovely woman, and I have a vivid picture of them sitting in the foyer of that home on Washington Street. They had a stained glass window over the transom, or stained glass insert over the transom of that door entrance. They also had a wind-up bell on the outside of the door, a big bell, and you had to wind it up for it to ring. And we went by on a Sunday to see her, and she'd already had her accident, was not doing well, and she and Schmolyankel, there was a bench on the right-hand side as you walked in, a 2-seater, and they were both seated on this bench, and the lights from the transom were shining down on them. The sunlight was quite bright on that day, and she had her hand bandaged, but I think she, as I recall it, she was soaking her finger in presumably hot water or something like that, and they were sitting there when we came in on that day. But other
It's a
than
great
that,
image.
How old was she when she passed away, Ted? Do you think about how old?
well, you have to try to start figuring out the ages of children and when it all began, and I don't honestly know. She was, let us say, middle-aged at very best. There's a photograph that I saw last night for the first time of Schmolyankel that I think is a remarkable photograph of him. If you remember, he's seated alone. It's a single photograph, and if you look at that, he has a remarkable smile on his face, in his eyes and in the lips, slightly parted, very parted, but he had a beautiful beard. Beard was immaculately trimmed at that time. So he was, I'm going to say he would have been 60-ish. I'm guessing purely because that was, he died in, what, 48?
50.
50. He died in 50.
And he
So-
was 96 or so.
51.
All right, so that's almost,
51 was it?
that's a fairly decent guess then, that he was in his early 60s or getting close to that age at the time that she passed away.
She passed away in 1928,
Right.
according.
That's right.
That's
And she was born in 1961.
I'm sorry.
She was 1861.
And I think he was born in 1856. Do you have that?
Yes, 1858.
1858.
Before we get away from, you mentioned photograph, I want to remind you that the classic photograph of Schmolyankel was a picture, basically a snapshot that was taken by one of Stanley's mother's relatives.
Uncle.
Um,
Brother.
Mendel
Mendel.
Siegel.
Mendel
Mendel Siegel was a businessman here, but he was one of the first serious amateur photographers. And he would go around taking pictures of everything he saw. And one day he came over to the house on Washington Street, and Schmolyankel was sitting on the front porch in a swing that was on the front porch,
Remember the swing?
studying the Talmud. And Mendel came up and just took a picture. And that picture now is in the homes of most of
All
us.
of us have it. Children
And
have it.
that picture is as magnificent a work of art as you'll see in photography.
Yes.
If you look at the hands of Schmolyankel on that book, he wasn't just holding the pages down, he was caressing the book. And Mark Chagall would have been served well by that particular picture, and it just happened. And when you mentioned that photograph you saw last night, it reminded me of this picture.
Right. Well, it's interesting because Schwartz used to, particularly when he was no longer able to walk to the synagogue, it was his habit to be on the porch whenever the weather was good. He loved to be out there. It was a big, expansive porch, and it had a little table in addition to the swing that you referred to. And he would sit there, and without fail, as services ended, everybody had to go south because that's where the people lived. There was nothing beyond where the synagogue was.
This house was a block and a half away from the shul.
That's right.
Oh.
And they all came by there,
On
and they would all
Washington?
stop.
Washington
On
Street.
Washington.
That's right. They would stop, walk up the steps there to bid him good Shabbos or good Yontiv, or just to say hello to him or whatever it was. And if they were lucky, maybe to have a little schnapps or a glass of wine along with it. And that was a custom. Every people belonging and active in the synagogue, even if they didn't know him real well, knew that Reb Shmuel Yankel was there. And
Did
that
he
was-
speak English?
Oh yeah, he spoke enough to get by. I'll give you an example. He was a heavy smoker, cigarette smoker. And at age, how old was he when he died? 90 what?
Well, do the math.
Quickly.
Wasn't my best subject. 1858 to
51,
yeah, 51.
93.
93. Somewhere around his 90th age. Somewhere around that, give or take a
There are
little
all kinds
bit.
of estimates of this. I give you 93 as a guideline.
Yes.
That's right. Well, somewhere around that, he must have had some illness or something, wasn't feeling good, and his doctor told him he should give up smoking. So that was not the easiest thing in the world, but he ostensibly gave up smoking.
This is it.
One day he couldn't be out on the porch. He was lying on the sofa in that big living room that he had there. And he was on the couch, and some gentleman came by to visit him, pay his respects to Reb Shmuel Yankel. And he walks in and he's smoking a cigarette. And my grandfather says to him, "You smoke a cigarette?" He says, "Yes, sir." He says, "I am." He spoke good English. He said, "What kind of cigarette you smoking?" He says, "This is a Lucky Strike." "Lucky Strike? I never tried that kind. You got an extra one?" And he took a cigarette right then and there from him. Sure, he spoke English. He knew how to get along. He was a quiet person, basically. He did not really talk a great deal or exuberantly in any particular way. But
Tell us about Thomas.
well, I was going to wait until they wanted to get to Thomas a little bit.
We're definitely going to
Yeah,
get to
good.
him. I want to pull back a little bit because there's so much to talk about Shmuel Yankel, but I want to make sure that we don't leave the record without talking a little more about Elka. Are there any other stories? You had firsthand memory, of course, Uncle Ted, but does anyone remember Shmuel Yankel or your own parents talking about her influence on the family, or anything about her relatives, her ancestors, her brothers, anything about her that we could get for the record?
Marvin never really talked about them. I mean, he certainly referred to the pictures that we had, and he would take the children. Many a Sunday we would take the children when they were very young and drive down Washington Street, is it Washington Street?
Yeah.
And he would show them where the old synagogue was, and he'd point out this was Shmuel Yankel's house and this was so and so, and he would show them all where they lived and what it was like, and how he would walk to services with Avram Meir to services, every Saturday, and what life was like down there, because it had changed so when the children were growing up. There was really nothing there that they could really pinpoint. And when I married, it was the last year we were in the old synagogue on Washington Street, so I remember the first year of our marriage. I think we moved to a Hababakim on Northside Drive in 57. So in 56, we were still down on Washington Street.
Of course, I was named for Elka Razel, as was Ronnie's sister, Elsa, was also named for her. And my mother, in talking about her mother, painted a picture for me of a very, used the word elegant, stately, elegant woman, a woman of rectitude, but one who had sort of special talents of being not only linguistically, but being able to communicate with new arrivals. And in many ways, in later years, Mother used to compare her to Rita Epstein. And it
who,
was
for
that
the record,
sort of
sorry,
image.
who was Rita Epstein, for the record?
Rita Epstein was the Rebbitzin, the wife of our rabbi for many years, Rabbi Harry Epstein.
Coincidentally, who came to Atlanta the year that she died. So she actually, to my knowledge, never knew them.
And in what way
And
did
Rita
she
Epstein is a very elegant woman,
Yeah, she,
with tremendous presence.
Spoke many languages.
Yes, and educated,
Very educated.
and greatly admired by men and women.
And so is in this vein that she would compare the two of them?
Yes, it was in the vein that she was sort of unusual for her time. I think she had 2 college degrees,
That's
and she was but she was also a very elegant woman. I mean, that's the only term that comes to mind. But she was highly respected, as Stanley says, by everybody. And she and our mother were very, very, very close friends. And they were, Harry Epstein and Rita would from time to time come over and have dinner at our house, because there weren't many places they would consider sufficiently kosher to eat.
Sure.
And I remember as a little kid seeing a rabbi who was about that far from God in my eyes, sitting around with his shoes off, talking. Your father, Stanley, was over on a couple of occasions, and they would, it was just strange to see the Rebbitzin and the rabbi out of character, with their shoes off and their hair down.
Yeah. My father presented a picture of his mother as the family genius. Not just a writer, but what she wrote was something that obviously stirred his imagination. He would say, for example, she not only had to inform people of the deaths of family, but she would have to write love letters and letters of marriage proposal for people. And that obviously requires a gift of imagination and a power of communication that made, anyway, an indelible impression on her. Almost never spoke about her, but when he did, it was in those terms. Like everything else, there was we're breaking secrets here. We're breaking silences. Good thing.
I have to tell you a secret about the rabbi and Ms. Epstein were very close to my parents. And I'm at the University of Michigan. I get a call on a Sunday night. I used to call, but this time Dad called me. He says, "Ronald." I said, "Yes, sir." He used to call me Ronnie. This time, Ronald. I knew I was in trouble. He said, "Guess where I am?" I said, "I hope you're in Atlanta." He says, "I'm in your bedroom." And he says, "The rabbi, Ms. Epstein, are here." And we had a debate on a word. We weren't sure what it meant. And I remembered you had this dictionary on your desk. So we're here at the desk looking at your dictionary. He says, "Ronald, this is not a dictionary. It was the European Encyclopedia of Sex." And he opens it up, and of course all these drawings are there, and my dad just was mortified, you know, and wanted me to know how bad a boy I was. So, I'd forgotten it was still there.
But he had to phone you on the
Oh yes,
spot.
Dad always let me know when I was the black sheep of the family, for sure.
That is a secret, Ronnie.
Oh, yeah.
Before we leave Elka and move to Schmelienko, Ed Fagelson, does anybody know about him, want to speak to him?
But Ed Fagelson was on the other side of the family. He was related to our dad, right? Elliott?
That's correct.
He was,
I
that
remember the name,
came
but-
from that. He, and
The first time I've heard the name.
No, I remember
Ray's
the
the
name.
name. Ray, it was his
Ray,
wife.
Ray was his wife, and I think Ed had a brother also that lived in Atlanta. But we were friendly with them on a relationship level, and would see the Fagelsons from time to time, not with any great regularity, but we kept in touch with them, and we knew them well, and they knew us well, and it was that's about the extent of it. But his speaking about having relatives in the city, that's what brought our father to Atlanta. I'm sure he first went to New York and stayed there for a short while and didn't like it, but he had an uncle, Uncle Mendel, who lived in Atlanta already. Mendel Cohen, I think was his last name, whom we never knew real well, but we knew him as he got older, and because our dad would keep in touch with them and we would see them from time to time. But that's what brought most people. How the original one got there, we may never know, but the newer ones came because there was a connection. There was somebody to steer them in the right way when they came there. So Fagelson was a part of the family, but not connected with the Goldstein branch in any way other than as the other side of the family relatives, I guess the easiest way to say it.
Okay. So back to Schmelienko. You all have mentioned the meticulous way in which he trimmed his beard, his sitting on the porch with the Talmud, his sort of devotion to the text. And I wondered if you all could share some memories, both firsthand and stories told to you by your own parents. What kind of a person was he? Father, grandfather, brother? And what was his relationship to Judaism in terms of sort of from the religious point of view onto community involvement, traditions and rituals and that sort of thing? Just sort of paint a picture from your own experience and stories you've heard about who this man was in relation to the family. Anyone?
Well, I can give you some information that I know of. When you ask his connection with religion, he was devoutly religious and davened 3 times a day forever. And when he could not go to the synagogue, he davened at home. And you mentioned about Thomas. One of the things about Thomas is that Thomas would be at the house every day.
Explain who Thomas is.
Yeah, I will in just a second. That Thomas was always there. Thomas carried a Yiddish edition of the Forward in his back pocket all the time, and Thomas spoke some Yiddish. But he was there for the point I'm making, to be able to say Amen when Schmelienko was davening by himself. That was just part of the Thomas story. But to get back to him again for just a minute, Schmelienko was very active in raising funds for in those days, what was ever called the Hebrew school. It was
Hebrew Benevolent Society?
no, that was a different organization, but I think he did work for them too. But he had a walking stick that had a gold handle on it that was given to him, inscribed with his name from the Hebrew school or whatever the organization was, in thanks for his work with them. And he was given the honorary title, as I referred to earlier, of Reb Shmuel Yankel. They didn't call everybody that, but his name always appeared that way. If you want to talk about Thomas at this intersection.
I think we'll come back to him if that's
Okay.
all right. If you would, just since you brought him up, just sort of mention his relationship to the family, then we'll come back to him. But I want to sort of stay with the Schmelienko.
Well, the only way I can say about his relationship to the family is that he was essentially part of the family. I don't know where he came from. I don't know how he came to us. I don't know how Schmolyankel found him or he found Schmolyankel. I just don't know anything about that. I don't know what Thomas's last name really was. If recollection serves me correctly, he was buried as Thomas Goldstein. And I had the opportunity to speak at his funeral. And he was just an incredible person. And
I wanted to mention one other thing because everybody, before we get into specifics on Thomas, who we'll talk about, but the house on Washington Street that you were describing earlier was particularly for a young kid, a place of wonder and mystery.
yeah.
It was a big house. It was almost mansion-like in terms of proportions.
Mm-hmm.
Had many, many, many rooms, and some of them doors were closed, and you wondered what was behind those doors. But also, it had two stairways. It had a front stairway, like houses do today, but it also had a back stairway that went down the back into a work area. And so that was also a mysterious thing. Attached to and built onto the house was a year-round sukkah. And even though you're supposed to build sukkahs temporarily, this was there. But in order to observe the openness to the sky during the Sukkot, they had rigged up two pulleys and had a retractable roof like a lot of football stadiums do today, so that they could keep the roof down during the year, and then when Sukkot came, they would wind it up. In the backyard of his house, there were two small cabins that I think were rented out on occasions.
Well, mostly always.
They were two little cabins in the back. There was a big, huge fig tree, which produced multitudes of figs that they would pick and other people would pick. If you kept going back through the backyard, you came to an alley. And on the other side of the alley was the recreation room, the playground of a school called Crew Street School.
Elementary school.
And it was an elementary school, Crew Street School, but it was also where we first went to Sunday school, at Crew Street School. And we would be dropped off at Sunday school and then go over that wall in the back after school was out and go into Schmolyankel's house until we got picked up there. Ronnie was at Crew Street School. He was a little kid. He was a few years younger than me. And he would come over and wait at Schmolyankel's house and we'd play over there after Sunday school. One of the heads of the superintendent of the Sunday school, so to speak, was also a relative of ours, and that was Ida Mae Goldstein. Joe's daughter was sort of like the principal of the Sunday school. And she had to, of course, put up with some mischievous kids and things like that. But that school was right behind the house, and that backyard was sort of a strange place. Right next door, the Shochet lived, the ritual slaughterer lived, and his name was Edelstein.
Right, he lived on the right side. Yeah.
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 Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
And he lived on the over there, and you would see him from time to time killing chickens in the backyard. next to Schmulyankel's house. But this house was I mean, you could write a book about the house. One last thing, on the other side of the house was sort of like an apartment house, right?
Yeah.
It was an apartment
Looked like
house.
that.
And the first felony case that I ever defended in court, the alleged crime occurred in that house, next door to Schmulyankel. So I was familiar with the lay of the land.
You know who lived in that house was the shamus, P.S. Klein.
He lived across the street.
I thought he lived next door.
No.
Who lived there?
He lived across the street. Different people. It was an apartment house. It was not just one person.
Yeah, I knew that there were more residents
But
there.
Shamus Klein lived across the street from him, not there because, and the reason I knew that is when I had to prepare for my defense in this felony case, I had to go back and walk through the area.
You know, Bessie Rice taught at that school.
That's right. That's
Where at the crew?
The funniest day I can remember as a little boy was when they dropped me off to spend a day with Bessie Rice at that school. I've never seen anything like it. She was like a comedian. And she had those kids eating out of her hand. They were very, very poor children at that time. I've never seen a teacher before or since like Bessie Rice, but she was a wonderful teacher. And I learned a lot from her.
She taught me one summer. I was a midterm student, and it was my mother's decision based on talking to teachers that I should not be a midtermer because it would screw up high school years and all that. So for one summer, Bessie taught me so that I could pass a half grade, which would bring me up 1.5 grade sooner. And I met her on certain days of the week in our dad's office in the old Grant building. She would come meet me there, and there was a little room where we could sit down and she would teach me the work that I needed to know, which was not easy for her to do, but she worked at it and she did a good job.
You talking about
Maybe.
Bessie Rice?
Yeah.
Oh, Bessie Rice. I hope we get to her sometime. I'd like to talk about her because she used to say to me, they asked me, I don't know how they ever learned anything. I can't believe I was a teacher, you know. And she did have the most amazing sense of humor.
She was Alvin Ramirez's daughter.
She was Marvin and Irving's sister. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to get to that generation and your relationships, but
These are sweet stories. I can add one thing to the house. Ted and Elliott know it 1,000 times better than I do because of Aunt Ida ran the house. And Friday night, as far as I know, Shabbos was prepared by her. Oh, well, you've already talked about
Yeah,
her
not much.
getting over there, but that's an endless set of stories. But I actually discovered the basement of that house. I don't know if either of you ever tried that. It was a very frightening
I was too scared.
experience.
I was too scared.
It was not too scary.
It was for me to go
Too
anywhere
scary.
where I couldn't
Yeah,
see.
it was almost too
Me
scary to do
too.
anything, and I inched my way in. I was told that Zadie made wine down there, and I thought I wanted to see how you make wine and what it looks like. But I got far enough into the place where it became absolutely pitch black. And if there was anything beyond where I was, I couldn't tell that wine. So that basement is still a black mystery in my head, what went on there.
Let me add one other thing about the house, which is different from the way things are today. They had 2 kitchens. They had 2 sinks, 2 stoves, actually 3 stoves. I'll get to the 3rd stove in a minute. They had to have a milk kitchen and a fleshy kitchen. It was, and you didn't wash the meat dishes in the milk kitchen's sink. And so they had 2 refrigerators, actually 3.
Iceboxes.
Icebox.
Yeah.
And then they had still, I remember this very well, a wood-burning stove in the kitchen, in one of the
big
kitchens.
The big kitchen.
And they had recently installed a more modern stove, but that was still there and was still used, where they would wad up paper and put wood in and start the fire in the kitchen in Shmuel Yankel's house.
You know, that's a very remarkable story about the house in Schwartz, and to hear you all talk about it, because Marvin talked about it a lot. And it must have made an impression on all of you, because I hear you all talk about it so much, and Ronnie. And it just seems to me that it, you know, not knowing and not being part of this at all, but it just seems to me that whatever happened there had a definite effect on all of you, that it sort of, it molded you, it sort of set you forth on a path of an example of what went on, and maybe this is where it all began, and you go generation to generation, but it had such an extreme effect on all of you.
Yeah, it did. I remember we would go over there for Passover Seders in the big dining room, and it was always a large crowd around the table, and
With some strangers.
yes.
There were some strangers.
Oh yes, and I remember one impact I'll never forget. There was somebody who stayed with our grandfather, for a period of time. And when he rolled his sleeve up, he had a tattoo with a number on his sleeve, on his arm. And this was somebody who had come from the camps. His name was Kurt Hamburger.
Oh.
And Kurt Hamburger had lived there for a period of time, and I remember him at the Seder table. The whole room became a mixture, not just a family, but as Stan points out, guests, strangers. During the war, soldiers from Fort Benning, or the Naval Air Station outside of Atlanta. And but that house, Rita, and I think you make a very good point, the house itself has had an impact on all of us, apparently, a very memorable one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna have you hold for 1 second.
Did Shmuel Yankel work? What was his job? And my recollection is that when he first came over, he was a peddler. And in those days, as I understand it, there were certain houses, wholesale houses, that would stock these peddlers. They would give them some merchandise, and they would go out and sell the merchandise off their back. And if they made a little money, and as I understand it, with Shmuel Yankel, it happened that he would then buy a horse cart to drive around and peddle these goods. The goods were supplied by, the one that I remember was a company called H. Mendel and Son.
Helen's father's company.
My grandfather.
Yeah, your grandfather.
I worked there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember that place. A friend of mine used to work there too. There was some relationship. And I forget, I went down there one Saturday to see my friend. I'm maybe 13, 14 years old. And I walked into the place and was looking for him. And all I saw was his other employees there, floor after floor. And when my friend, his name was Pat Unger, showed up, I said to him, Dr. Livingston, I presume, because he was the only person who was not black working in that place. But anyway, they would get these, be stocked by these wholesale houses, and that's what, that's how he made his money. When he saved up a little money, he would buy small properties, houses, on the south side of town. I remember Conley Street and Pulliam Street were the two that I recall. And one of the things that our mother did in later years, she had the responsibility of going around and collecting the rent from
Thomas
these
did
tenants.
Thomas was the one, just to embellish on that story a little bit, because that's exactly true. Thomas used to take you, first of all, to get his hair cut and have the beard trimmed and that sort of thing. But Thomas would take him on his rounds to collect the rent. And invariably, as it would happen, these were poor houses, poor people, and these were all black families. And he'd walk up door, knock on the door, and he'd tell them that he wants the rent. Shmuel uncle would tell him. And the lady would say, "I'm sorry, Miss Goldstein, we ain't got no money this month." And Thomas would give him an elbow in the side and speak to him in pidgin Yiddish and say, "She's lying. Tell her she's got to pay you today." And they'd pay him. But he knew that they were playing games with him, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it.
You know, I wanted to tell you a story that Marvin told me and told the children, because I think it's very remarkable. He told when he was a very young boy, very young, he used to go with his father, Alva Mayer. His father had a cart drawn by a horse, and his father used to collect rags. And they used to go down to the Ku Klux Klan headquarters, down wherever it was in that area, and used to collect the old sheets. They used to buy the old sheets from the Ku Klux Klan, which I think is unbelievable that a Goldstein would buy the old sheets from the Ku Klux Klan, and he remembers vividly, and we had a picture, and I've been trying to find it, of Alva Mayer and Marvin on this cart with this horse, but he talked about it a lot. It was it was an experience that made a big impression on him.
The Alva Mayer, somebody mentioned this yesterday, I believe, but Alva Mayer, whenever he would see me on the street someplace, and he would say, you were in the Navy, Ted, at this time, and he would say, how is Teddy? And I would say, he's okay, everything's fine. And his eyes would tear up, and he'd reach in his pocket and pull out some money and put it in my hand. And that, he didn't say anything, just gave the money because he was so happy. At every single time I would see Alva Mayer during those years, I have such a distinct recollection of his doing that.
That's the first time I know he was giving you the money. You should have been saving it
never
when
got
I
it.
came home.
Well, he didn't tell me it was for him.
I need to tell you one story about Alva Mayer. Alva Mayer made medicine. He made medicine out of watermelon seeds. And when I would go over to his house, where we spent many Shabbat dinners, and I would sneak out the back, go down these long steps, and in the back was the black neighborhood. And I would play with the kids. And I would go to their houses, and I remember at least two fathers telling me, "Your grandfather's such a great man. He cured my wife from this." I mean, this medicine would cure all the ills. And I would ask him, I said, why don't you make this for everybody? He says, "No, I'll make it for my friends." I never knew how he did this, but I tried to eat a lot of watermelon to keep me healthy. Never did.
Ronnie, you talk about playing with the black kids in the
Yes.
neighborhood. That's who we would play with behind Shmuel Uncle's house.
Sure.
And on Sundays, I remember on Sunday school days when you would come over, you and I would be in the backyard, and the kids that we were playing with in the neighborhood were the black kids who lived there.
And you know, it's interesting, you mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. When Dad and Marvin integrated the hotel, because the family established the first hotel after World War II. It was called Peachtree Manor Hotel. And it was true that Ivan Allen actually called Dad to see if he would integrate the hotel, because it was Jackie Robinson
No,
who
Hank
wanted to
Aaron.
come.
Hank Aaron.
Hank Aaron was coming
Jackie
with the
Robinson.
Milwaukee Braves to the Atlanta Braves, and he wouldn't stay in a segregated hotel. And he said that Hank Aaron, he only would stay if it was, says, would you,
See, I was told it was Jackie Robinson.
no, it was Hank Aaron. I remember that
Okay.
vividly.
Well, Jackie Robinson, the only reason not to challenge what you're saying, Rita, because I would never do anything like that, for fear Marvin would look down on me, and I can't afford that. But the reason that it may have been Jackie Robinson is that Jackie Robinson came here for an exhibition game
Right.
with the Atlanta Crackers.
No.
This was
That's a long
I don't
time
want
ago.
it to contradict both of you, but what really happened was the American was being built, and we only had about 30 rooms so open at the time. And when Ivan Allen called up, because he was so instrumental in getting the Milwaukee Braves to come to Atlanta as the Atlanta Braves, and he was so instrumental in getting that team to come, that he said, would you please integrate the American Hotel, because we have a problem. Hank Aaron, they will not stay in a segregated hotel. And Marvin said, I can't integrate the American because we're really not open yet. We only have 30 rooms. But my brother and I own the Peachtree Manor Hotel, and we'll be happy to integrate that tomorrow, which they did, and they integrated the Peachtree Manor Hotel.
There's a whole
And they had the Ku Klux Klan marching around,
right.
and they had
marching
the
around. They burned a cross on our lawn.
and they had the
They had death
NAACP.
threats.
I mean, it was really a very, but it was the first hotel integrated in a new
That's
state.
how
office
baseball
in that?
came to Atlanta.
Yeah, but
Pardon?
Didn't you have offices in that building? In the
Yeah,
Peachtree
Peachtree
Manor?
Manor,
Yeah,
dental
downstairs.
office was there.
You know, you mentioned the Klan, and just for the record, in that story, I remember they burned a cross on the lawn. Years later, I am running in my first political campaign for the state legislature, and I'm going around knocking on doors in all parts of Atlanta. And I come to one sort of auto shop, mechanic shop, and I knock on the door to go in and hand them my campaign literature and everything. And I see on the wall Ku Klux Klan signs, the burning fiery cross, and this, that, and the other. I had walked into the office of the Kleagle of that particular clavern of the Klan. And I'm out there campaigning, you know, Jewish kid campaigning out there. Turns out that, without going through the whole story, those guys ended up voting for me instead of the other people who were running in the race at the same time. And the reason was they viewed these other people, I mean, sure, I was Jewish, and that's a pretty big strike against you in the Klan, but these other people were economic elitists. They were the rich people, and they were the other side of the tracks. And these guys, as much as they didn't like Jews, it was better than having the rich people run
And
their
anyway,
lives.
you asked for their vote.
I did. That's exactly right. That's exactly
I'm going
right.
to tell you one more Klan story. My parents used to send me away to camp. That was a threat every year because I was not a good boy. And at one time I was at the scout camp, which was near Atlanta, and I would run away from camp wherever I was sent. This one time I ran away and with a little black boy that was there, and we came across this tower. I was very young, and we climbed the tower, huge tower, and we're up there just relaxing. Next thing you know, people start to congregate down there. It was a Klan session. And they burned the cross, talked about the Jews and the blacks, and I stood up there shivering, knowing if they found us up there, we thought that they would kill us. Because here's a Jew and a black, and that's who they're talking about. That's the most frightening I think I've ever been.
Ronnie,
I
I didn't know
stopped
you,
running away at
I
that
did
point.
not know that you were that bad a boy.
Oh, I was a bad boy. How I ever got to where I got today, I
He
don't
was a
know.
bad, he was
I
a
have no
bad
idea.
boy. He was very bad.
I know we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to make sure that we talk about the other siblings, Rose, and any more about Joe, any more stories about Alva Mayer, and other siblings in that generation? Are there stories that you remember about them? Anything that Danny or you
Yeah,
talked about?
Rose came out to Sacramento to live. And she wasn't out there but a couple of years. Did not like it and turned around and went, I think, to Florida. Is that right? Yeah. And that's the last we heard of her. We never heard from her again. While she was in Sacramento, she saw Fanny a lot, but she just never made it with anyone. So she went to Florida, and there I think she found her happiness.
Do you remember what year that was?
Pardon?
Do you remember the year exactly?
Mm.
Can you relate it to something?
It would go back to when I was probably in my teens. So it'd be maybe 60 years ago, something like that.
It can be it.
I have to tell you a story about Alvaro Mayer. He had to be the greatest sleeper I'd ever known. My parents would drop me off at a place to stay because they would go out of town a lot. And I was a young boy at the time, and they'd drop me off Alvaro Mayer to spend the night. And I'm spending the night, and all of a sudden I hear shaking on the door downstairs. I don't sleep very well at nights. And I hear that, and I got up and ran into Alvaro Mayer's bedroom, and he and Annie is sleeping. And I tried to wake him up. I could not wake him up. I thought someone had killed him. I thought that the robber had come in. I ran back to my room, and just then there's a chase. Policemen are coming around there, and the robber had robbed the house next door to the right. We knew the people were there, and the policeman shot him right in front, right on Capitol Avenue. But Alvaro Mayer never got up. I could not wake he up or Annie. I thought they were dead, and I thought I was it, the next one. So I still don't sleep well at night.
One last thing we ought to say about Alvaro Mayer and the influence he had on so many people. He had a rag warehouse on Decatur Street or DeKalb Avenue, some place over in that part of town. And he was always very generous to people who would come
He was very
around
charitable.
and they say, I don't have any money, I need to get something from it. And he would always give them money. One day, it was on a weekend, if I remember correctly, he gave, two people came by to get money, and he gave it to them, and then they murdered him.
It was on a Sunday,
Yeah.
and we're all packed and ready to go to the Alpha Omega Dental Convention because Dad was very active.
He was going to take me with
To the,
Yeah.
we were all ready to go out of the house, and we got the call that Alvaro Mayer had actually opened up the store. I mean, it wasn't open on Sunday, just to give them some money.
It was two young
black guys.
boys.
And they robbed him, I think, of $12.
Something, it was
Yeah,
ridiculous.
$12.
It was in the
$6
40s,
each one of
wasn't
them.
it?
It was in
48.
48, I thought.
I'm sorry, it was in,
48.
It was either
I think
40s and me.
it was, could have been
I read the
December of
obituary
48.
today.
It may have been December of 48.
Dad was president
I think it
elected,
was
something
48
like
because I
that. He
read
was
it in
an
the
officer at that
obituary
time.
today.
It was
In
it was
the
in
book.
the it was
Yeah,
in
it's
the
in the
end of
book.
the year because their meetings were always in the end of the year.
That's the kind of man he was.
Yeah.
Give anything
But
to
he
him.
had, like you were referring to my uncle, he had, as he progressed in his business, he started buying property, Alvaro Mayer, and he started buying property, houses and what have you. And I remember Marvin telling me that when he passed away, he had acquired for those days and for those times, he had a sizable, I don't know what his estate was, but they had things that were of value for Annie and for the family. I mean, he was already in business.
I was just telling another story about not them, but about Uncle Morris and Uncle Irving, or as most often he let me call him Uncle Itchke. That was his name, and this is when they were living in Sacramento. Uncle Morris, well, Uncle Irving, let's start with Itchke first. He was always,
Didn't like that name.
didn't like
He
it,
did
but
not.
he
Didn't
said
like
we
that
could
name.
call
Said
him.
it's a dog's name.
Yeah, so, but he was always very well groomed. He was just
Yes,
spit and
that's-
polish, and whatever he was terrific. The only person who could do him better was Uncle Morris. Uncle Morris was to the nines probably one of the best dressed men of his age that I can possibly ever remember. And all the photographs that you'll see of him are like that. If it's the summertime, he has on his new boater for the summer, beautiful straw hat. He had a double-breasted blue blazer on, white pants or flannel pants. I mean, he was always immaculate. Uncle Morris wore glasses. And Uncle Morris had the only car that I knew of that the family had. And he used to take Uncle Irving for rides. There was a problem. Your daddy was the one who told the story. Uncle Morris couldn't see. He had thick glasses and he could not see. And he'd ride this way, go up the curb, just okay, came to a railroad track. Your daddy was hollering, Morris, you're in the wrong lane. You got to watch out, there's a train coming here. Didn't make any difference to him. He would barrel on, and thank God they made it through all the time.
Now I know who
But-
Marvin took after. He was the worst driver in the world.
But there were great stories about that, of the relationship that the two of them had during those years that they were together. And it happened, as Stanley said
I
earlier.
remember they both wore keychains. You remember keychains?
Yeah.
And Morris and your father, Irving, always had these really smart keychains on and
I
very
have a
dapper.
pair of them sitting on one of my walls in my home.
Yeah.
Still
You know,
today.
Uncle Irving was, I was one of the happiest in his later years when he was in Atlanta, and he was running the liquor and wine store that we had across the street
Across
from
the
the
street
Peachtree
from
Manor
the
Hotel.
Peachtree Manor.
I used to spend a lot of time in there, and I've never seen so many people would come in. They all knew Uncle Irving.
He was the dearest,
He
sweetest,
knew everybody.
They loved him.
dearest, sweetest, most lovable person.
The women would
Ever
come in,
met.
they would hug him, and he loved it. He
Oh, it was
just
wonderful.
he just loved
He
doing
had a
it.
smile that lit up the room.
Yeah.
When they
You had
moved to
Okay.
No,
You had
so
also
when they
people-
moved to Sacramento, they lived right behind us. We had a duplex and they were in an apartment upstairs. And he would get, in the summertime, at night, he'd get undressed to his shorts, and I could see him. So I called one time, I took my phone out in the back, and I disguised my voice, and I told him that I was a neighbor, and I'm very impressed. You saw him look around. Who was this neighbor? And then he'd go to the drapes and close them, and I would hang up. I did it for, I think, 3 nights in a row. And the third night, I finally said to him, I gotta tell you, it was me. But he had a sense of humor.
Oh, that's a sweet story.
Yeah, great
But I loved
stories,
your
yeah.
mother too, Stanley.
I did too.
Oh,
Yeah.
she was just such a wonderful woman. And when I bought first piano for the children, I remember it was, we saw an ad in the paper, and I didn't know a thing about piano. I was not musically inclined at all, so I called her up and asked her, would she go out and look at the piano and play it for me and tell me whether it was something I should buy. And she did. She went out there and she did. And she said, it's very nice. It'd be a nice piano for you to have. And so we bought it, you know. She was just a wonderful person.
Along that same line, when one of the times y'all were living in Atlanta, it was in 1953, the year no, it was later, it was the second time, when Miriam and I got married. And she knew, I took her over to meet Miriam, this was before we got married, and she knew that Miriam had been trained as a classical pianist, and she'd gone to school on a music scholarship and done a lot of performing and all that. So we visited for a little while, and usual with them, and then Fanny says, sit down at the piano. And she sat at the piano, and she made her play. And got there, she says, "It's okay." That was,
Just checking.
yes, just checking. Just
We're
checking.
about to lose one of our members, so before you go, I just want to make sure that there's nothing related to Thomas or Avram Meir or Shmuel or anyone that you want to add, because.
Well, the only thing I would like to add is that the influence I think that Avram Meir had, I mean, he was not a talker a long time. He would tell you just what it was very, very briefly. But obviously he and Annie motivated both my dad and mother. Dad was president of so many organizations, as was his brother Marvin. And mother, what they called her Babe. She didn't want to be called mother. But she would take charge of whether it's a funeral or anything else. She'd walk into a house and she would take charge.
She taught us all how to do things.
Yeah, it had to be done her way.
Her way, but it was usually the right way.
Yes. As I have one example I'll tell you. She was very strict, and it had to be done her way. When I was driving, I got my license a little bit too early, but when I was driving one day, and I think I was at a legal age this way, but I was driving down Piedmont towards Ponce de Leon. The light turned yellow, and I went through. And she said, "Pull over." I looked, I said, "What you mean?" She said, "Pull over, right there." I pulled over. She says, "Get out." I said, I didn't, what? She says, "Now you get home any way you can. Next time you stop when it's yellow." Slammed the door and left. And I had to get home. I had no money, I had nothing. I had to hitchhike my way home. It took me about 2.5, 3 hours. That was her lesson.
Well,
That's what I got.
I didn't have that kind of relationship with her because we got along so well. When I came into the family, I mean, my sister-in-laws were really my sisters, and Helen was like a sister to me. And Bessie and Ida and Lena and Jeanette, they were like sisters to me. You know, it was just, they welcomed me in. It was just amazing because I did marry Marvin, who I had 2 children, so as they say, you were bringing baggage with you. And they were a little bit, well, I think Marvin's mother was a little bit concerned about him marrying someone with 2 children. Unfortunately, I never met her. She passed away a year before we married, and I always was I'm sorry I didn't meet her, because she would have liked me, I think. But,
What you would have liked is the Sunday lunch. She made a steak that no one has ever been able to.
It's called Gedempta steak.
Gedempta steak. I mean, it had a little bit of gravy. I've never had a taste so good at the finest restaurants in the world.
I know I'm not a cook, but Marvin wanted me to make that steak, and she really just burned the steak on top, in chicken fat, I think, on top of the stove in the skillet. I mean, how they all didn't have clogged arteries at a younger age, I'll never know.
I've got to go to set up for the history of the family in.
Thank you so much, Ronnie.
See
you, Ronnie.
I do want to turn back to Thomas. Yeah,
What about the other siblings?
Rose
And Meridina?
Meridina, right.
I don't think we've mentioned them yet. And I'm not sure that Meridina lived in, when I was growing up, in Columbus, Ohio. And her husband was a shochet and a cantor, was
Yeah,
he?
he was a cousin. Yeah.
And
He had a son who was a singer.
and he had a son.
Eventually, yeah.
And I remember, and I used to hear stories that Jan Pierce,
Yes,
that's
the
right.
opera metropolitan tenor, would visit them and sort of took Harlan under his wing, as a matter of fact.
He would have Shabbos with them.
Yeah, and they would sing together. Jan Pierce had a song that, I think it was the Bluebird of Happiness, that he recorded.
That I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think that Harlan sang with him, or they made a recording of the two of them.
Well, how did Harlan become acquainted with Jane Pierce?
Through the father, who was in those family gatherings
I see.
on Shabbos when they were around.
Right.
Oh, and he would come. How was that? Yes, also because Jan Pierce and his brother was also an opera singer, would make a fortune of money as the chazan for the high holidays.
That's right.
In an immense congregation in Chicago. And before or after those visits, you would find him at the Liss household.
Yeah.
And I think Fanny used to play the piano for him.
Yeah.
I remember, again, as a kid, with our mother, we went to visit them in Columbus, Ohio. I remember going to their house, and that's where I met Harlan, and would play chess with Harlan on their front porch. And she was she was the mother of Sophie, who was Mark and Barry's mother. But my mother and Sophie were more like sisters.
Right.
They were very, very close. And that's where Mark and Barry's closeness came from. Sophie died at a relatively young age,
Oh, yes.
if I remember correctly. Died of cancer at a quite young age. But Meridina was our mother's oldest sister. And while they didn't live together in the same city, they were constantly in touch, the letters that went back and forth. And I have a recollection that the Lisses, before they ended up out in the Midwest and in Ohio or wherever, had spent some time in Maine, in Bangor, Maine. Does that ring a bell with anybody?
Yeah, Ronnie might have known something
Yeah,
about that.
he may know about that.
Well,
But we never really had that much contact with her. She was older, but I remember our mother was a constant correspondent with her, and took me to visit them when I was a kid.
I think it's important to add to that, that Mother and Morris had an ongoing Yiddish correspondence as long as I could remember, when there were letters constantly going one way and coming in the other way. So there was a tendency for them to be that close together. But Meridina came to Atlanta on several occasions, not every year, but maybe every 2 years or something like that. And she would come with Harlan. So we were very young. Harlan must have been 9, maybe 10, and I would have been 7 or 8 around that time. And of course, he was a big boy, and I was attracted to that. We could run around the block, and it would be safe. And she always came with 2 tin cans sealed with wax. She made strawberry preserves and brought them every time she came to Atlanta. And there was always a connection, but if you think about it, what I said about Uncle Irving and about Uncle Morris and even Uncle Joe, but to a lesser degree, they were all modern men. They were men of the times. And Meridina and Uncle Abraham were both old people. They always looked like old people. They never did, just as Ronnie was talking, and as Elliott was talking about when he would meet Uncle Abraham. But these others, they were incredible how they melded right in to that group, and they were already somewhat older compared to my mother and Aunt Rose were the babies of the family, so to speak. But it was interesting how they were attached to one another and maintained contact with each other.
Let me, did Uncle Joe study in a yeshiva
Is that Rita?
in Europe?
Yes.
That's what I thought, because Uncle Joe was, as it was presented to me, he was the scholar in the family.
Absolutely.
He was the learned person. He had studied at the yeshiva. But in
I'm going to tell
many
a story
ways,
about that tonight.
oh, really? Well, I don't want to.
No,
But one thing, but I also got the impression that he was not the most religious
Also true.
of the group. And again, this may be apocrypha, but I remember being told that one of the things that he was able to apply his Talmudic learning to was to be able to prove to his satisfaction that shrimp were kosher. That he loved shrimp but didn't want to eat them if they weren't kosher.
Right.
But he could go through the pill pool
Right.
and end up with kosher shrimp. I remember that. One summer,
It's amazing.
and I don't know why my parents inflicted this on him. I spent the summer with Uncle Joe and Aunt Minnie. It wasn't her name Minnie?
That's his first wife.
Aunt Minnie in Charlotte, and I worked in the National Linen
Right.
factory
Goodness.
plant there.
Yeah, I don't think it was Minnie. That was his second wife.
I think you're right.
It was his second wife.
There's a story about the first wife.
Yeah, there is a story about the first one.
And that wasn't her name?
He didn't go to do National Linen to lay. This was a miscarriage of justice, if you want to put it that way. Joe couldn't make a living. Where are you going to put a scholar? I mean, could he be a teacher? Was he licensed to teach at a university or whatever it required? He was brilliant in those things. But he had to make a living, so they tried to make a businessman out of him. And it was never good. They put him in. We had relatives with National Linen. They put a couple of our people in business at one time or another who weren't making it anywhere else. But it was...
They gave you a job.
I worked 2 summers. I drove the mail truck for National Linen in Atlanta. And Benny Cavalier, who was a lawyer.
He was successful though.
Yeah, he couldn't make a nickel being a lawyer. He and my daddy used to have long conversation about it. They gave him a job. He went to Nashville, opened a plant for them there, was successful,
That's very
left them, and opened his own business in industrial linens, and really hit it big up there. But Uncle Joe, it just never worked out the way that it, I should say, should have, but who knows what should or should not have been. But it was always
He's
unfortunate.
the odd one out of your description. I think a very good description of the people that looked old and the ones that seemed to allow themselves to become modern people.
Right.
Joe was neither quite of those.
That's right.
Yeah, he was.
It didn't.
That's exactly right.
Didn't fit.
Who was Goldstein in Florida?
Well, that's a different branch of the family. That's Sam Goldstein, and he has we always were very close with him, but that's from a different, not from Schwartz. It was his brother's family.
What, who, Uncle Joe's wife, the Karish was not?
No, that was the second one. She had 2 boys. Bobby, I think,
Right.
was one of them, and I forget the
do
other boy's name. And they lived in Gastonia, North Carolina, initially.
Right.
And that was, it just was one of those things.
One of his wives' father was a famous rabbi?
That's an interesting question. From the Midwest,
Yeah.
it couldn't have been Gershon Hattis.
I remember.
Because that's who they knew. That's who my mother knew through some other source. So I don't really know about that. But I think that maybe the second wife did have some connection with another family.
You don't know the story about the first wife? Do you know what?
I know very little about
My
it.
mother called her a beautiful girl. And whenever my mother used that expression, it meant that there had been a tragedy in the family. And I believed it all implicitly, and I still do to this moment. Before we get off of, I know you want to get to other things, but there's a story about Harlan. There are 3 Lisses, 3 of his children here. And I don't want it to get lost about Harlan and his musicianship. I was present, I won't try to go in detail, but we did the High Holidays. Harlan was studying music. He was in an opera company, small provincial opera company in Los Angeles, and had ambitions as a singer, and in fact had auditioned and was going to be auditioned. He had a provincial audition, then he was going to be nationally auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera,
Right.
no less. The summer before that was to happen in the fall, or the late summer, when the High Holidays came around, he was hired to perform the services as chorus, and he got 4 men together to be this chorus, and I was one of them. I conducted the chorus. How do you conduct 4 people? But he was, of course, the lead tenor, and he had another tenor, and he had a bass from their opera company, and I was the baritone. He taught me for 2 hours how to sing, so you can imagine. But I was a quick learner, and anyway, I was always on pitch, so I could anchor the thing. All I want to say about rehearsing with him and singing for 2 weeks, 2 sets of time for the High Holidays, is that he had a great voice. Now, it's not enough for the family to think that Harlan had a nice voice. Harlan didn't have a nice voice. He had a great voice. And he was diagnosed with cancer, cancer of the throat, within a couple of months after the High Holidays of 1948. I'll tell you how I know it's not important. It was my first year in Los Angeles when I had sort of crashed psychically and was giving up music and getting interested in philosophy and not knowing what I was doing. But one thing I did for the summer, for those 2 months, the summer, was to learn the liturgy for this and the music for this performance, for these services. And it's important to me to say that Harlan had a real shot at winning a contest for the Metropolitan Opera. He was thrilling. And somehow it's 3,000 miles away, and who doesn't know about, but I know. And I have some credentials for being able to evaluate musicianship. It was extraordinary, and came by it honestly. That is, through the family that Elliott was on.
Is it a story, is it apocryphal again, or is it imagination that he had a date set for his audition in New York with the Met, and it was, the story told me it was the same day that he received notice that he needed to have throat surgery.
That I don't know.
He was very young then when he was diagnosed, wasn't he?
Well, this
Yeah,
was, what year was it?
Well, I was 22, I think, so he was 28.
Yeah,
It's most unusual.
yeah.
It's very
It was a real tragedy, and it obviously.
Real I mean, that's a
I mean,
word
in fact,
place.
Yeah.
And what did he do? Stephen, who was, I think, in his cups last night, was talking about a lot of things, and one of the things he said is that, yes, Harlan had a tragedy, but I wouldn't exist, if he hadn't had that tragedy. Meaning, and he was the greatest father you can imagine. That's how he finished it. Meaning that he poured his lost, dashed ambitions into being the best father anybody ever had.
And
That
he was
it.
successful in what he, as
Absolutely.
an insurance man.
And what,
Yes.
you know, he was he?
Yes, I think it was insurance, wasn't it?
Yes.
Ultimately, but
Yes,
he went
and
through a
he-
number
yes,
of,
yes.
a
He,
number of,
he ran the Hertz rental business
For Bert,
yeah, for Bert.
Yeah.
Bert
nationally.
his older
Went to
brother.
Washington, to New York. Should we talk a little bit about Rose, because nobody's mentioned her yet? And
You're gonna have to talk about her tonight too, so, you, tonight.
I don't, what's tonight?
Tonight, you're on the program.
You're on the program, yes.
You better go home and
You
rehearse.
gotta talk about her and our mother, so
I
just,
didn't know anything
well,
about that.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
I'm
Tell
telling
us
you.
about Rose.
Well, for this purpose, though, I think we ought to
Yes,
include
that's
Rose.
fine. Absolutely.
And you probably knew her better than anybody, Ted. Now you talk about a person of their times. She was a woman of her time. She grew up, she became an adult during the flapper era. And she was a 20s woman. I remember as a little kid looking through her library and finding out all of these books that I shouldn't be reading that she had in her library. One was called The Companionate Marriage, which I remember.
That was a famous book.
And but she she became a social worker, and in later years got her degree and graduate degrees from Florida State University in social work. She lived in Atlanta for a period of time. Had she married Anderson by that time?
See, I knew her as
she'd
Rose
already
Anderson.
gotten- Yeah, she had already gotten her degrees.
I knew her as Rose
Yeah,
Anderson, yeah.
Yeah.
But she lived in Atlanta when I came in
Yeah.
touch with her. And I'm talking now, I'm 10 or 11 or 12 maybe.
She was.
At the Cox Carlton
Yeah,
Hotel,
there,
which
Cox.
was right next door to what is today the
Georgia.
Georgian Terrace. Do you remember the Cox
Oh,
Carlton?
sure.
And she had a room there,
Right.
and that's where she would work. And when I would go to the Fox Theater, I'd come over and visit her. And she asked me to review the reports, case studies that she was writing. And I remember one time, this was 1941, I was a member of a little Jewish club, boys club called the Menorah Club. And I went to a meeting on Sunday. And after the meeting, a friend of mine, who was the son of one of our mother's closest friends, his name was Dwoskin, Paul Dwoskin, decided to go to the Fox Theater to see a movie. So we walked from what was then the 10th Street, where the AA had a educational building, over to the Fox Theater and went to a movie. And when the movie was over, we were walking out and we heard all these people around us talking about the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese had killed all these people. We didn't know what that was all about. So I went across the street with Paul and visited Aunt Rose, and she had the radio on and explained to us what was happening. And that was, where were you when Franklin Roosevelt died, or where were you when you learned about it? And that's where I was with Rose Goldstein Anderson.
She was very well recognized in her field of social work. She received any number of significant awards for the things that she had done, the research that she had done, the treatment of patients, and all of that. So she was, she had done well in her career, but I just don't know a lot about her.
She
And
came
none
to
of us knew a lot.
She came to Sacramento, but she was not happy.
Right.
She was sad. Her life was sad.
But
There
she-
was
And I
an
tried
air
to
of
get her to
sadness
talk
about
about
her.
it.
She
For all
had,
of her,
exactly.
for all of her gaiety.
What year did she pass away? Because I remember her and I don't remember.
I should know.
I'll tell you how you can mark it.
Yeah.
You and Earlene were going to Mexico City.
You're right. You called me on the airplane.
I called you at the airport.
Yeah.
Where was she living?
She had been living she went down to Miami, and she was working for the social services department of the city of Miami Beach, and was pretty high up in their bureaucracy, and she lived down there. You visited there a
I
couple of
went
times.
once. I went one time actually, but my mother, as her illness progressed, went frequently. She she looked after. This was a role that my mother took, and I was going to say something about this tonight, about she took care of my grandfather's house. She ran the house, as Elliott has pointed out, and as others have. She was responsible. And we didn't talk about, you mentioned about when Kurt Hamburg lived there, but she looked after Aunt Rose, and she was with her constantly during those last few weeks and months of her life, and really was there to help make arrangements for her and all of that.
May I ask a question of the two? Did you know when Rose left the Washington Street house? Didn't she live with Zadie for some times in that house?
Yeah, but not for any length of time. After she became proficient and was moving around, because she went back to school, she went to California. She did.
But that's, no, Cal, that's sort of late in
Right,
the day.
yeah. But,
I mean, through her 20s, for example.
well, she might have been there that long, but there was always a problem about what to do with the house if my grandfather lived there. And Kurt Hamburger, went into the Army, and he was no longer available. They needed somebody to be in the house. There were 6 bedrooms, so Mother used to try to rent one of the bedrooms to a couple, preferably, not to do anything really, except in an emergency, to call her, to call the doctor, or whatever. And that worked fine, except that you got to replace them, this one moving away, and it was a merry-go-round, and it was a pain in the neck. But that's what she had to get done. And there were any number of different people who would spend 6 months, maybe a year. One of them might have stayed that long. But it was always that the house was empty otherwise, which brings up a story about Thomas. If you are...
Would you you back up and just sort of give me some context about him? Who was he, and who was he in relationship to the family?
Thomas was an African-American young man. I would guess he had to have been in his maybe 30s when I first knew about him. He was a jack of all trades. He could do anything. He was a plumber, an electrician, a painter, a carpenter. Anything you needed, Thomas could do and take care of. And how he became attached to the family, I don't know. Who found him, I don't know. Or did he find us? I don't know that. But he was always there. Thomas would always be there early in the morning, we knew. There was one time when our grandfather had nobody living, and he was not doing well. And my mother spoke to Thomas about it and said, well, maybe you could stay overnight and see. So fine, he said, no problem. She gets there probably at 7:30 in the morning that particular day. And she goes into the front door, and Thomas is sitting on this little couch that I said was in the foyer. And she says, what are you doing up so early? He says, well, I haven't been asleep. She says, well, didn't you stay in one of the bedrooms? He says, Miss Ida, I'm not supposed to lie down in your house.
Oh my goodness, that's such a...
True story.
Let me describe Thomas a little bit further. He was, as you pointed out, black, but he also had a white beard.
White beard.
And he and our grandfather, who had a reddish blonde beard, would sit on this love seat that Ted has mentioned inside the foyer. And one of them have their leg crossed one way and the other one the opposite direction, and they looked like black and white scotch. And they would sit there constantly. Both of them were chain smokers, and they would smoke until sundown on Shabbat. On Friday afternoon, they both stopped smoking. But they would sit there constantly just talking to each other. Thomas, as you pointed out, was capable of doing anything, plumbing, electricity, and so forth. And I remember, again, as a kid, he would come over to our house on Park Drive on the north side and do odd jobs around the house. And I remember he was repairing some wooden steps on the back door, and he was working away and had a pipe. Remember he smoked a pipe all the time.
Yes.
And while I was watching him, he would give his philosophy of life or things like that to me. And I remember he said, you have to, in order to work, you have to have three things. You have to have, this is Thomas talking now, you have to have something to work on. You have to have the tools to work with, and you have to have the will to work. And that was a Joel Chandler Harris type philosophy that I was being exposed to constantly by just being around Thomas. The story I want to tell you about Yiddish and Thomas has to do with our wedding, Babs and my wedding, which was at the Progressive Club. And and Thomas, of course, was invited to the wedding. And he came to the wedding really decked out. He had a white suit on, a hat, just absolutely.
Wore spats.
What?
Wore spats.
Oh, my.
And he was sitting in the audience waiting for the wedding to begin. There were a couple of Jewish women sitting in the row behind him. And one of them said to the other in Yiddish, "Gib a hook at the Schwartz dort," in the Weißer suit. And Thomas turned around and responded in Yiddish, "What's wrong with a black man here wearing a white suit?"
Oh, that's wonderful.
And that happened at our wedding. That was Thomas. He could
But
speak
you know,
Yiddish.
but when I think that you all said that you never knew his last name, and that when he died he was buried and he was called Thomas Goldstein, I think that it just speaks of the man in time. It just speaks of the family's connection to him.
Yeah.
So
Incredible.
remarkable.
Yeah.
Were there any people in his family that anyone knew?
We never knew that. We didn't know really where he lived.
lived.
We thought that he might have lived on Conley Street. He might have lived there was a little grocery store on Conley Street. He might have lived under the grocery store on Conley Street. We did not know exactly where he lived.
How many years was he there? How many years would you say?
I know that.
How many years was he with you all?
Well,
'Cause
All of
Danny
my
told-
life.
Huh?
I don't know how long before,
Yeah.
but all of my life.
Danny always
Well,
talked
he
about
sure made an impact on the whole family that had been in
yes.
contact with him.
You asked who was the connection, and again, stories. Benny Goldstein, Benny Cavalier, was supposed to have been afflicted with diphtheria as a kid and couldn't breathe. And Thomas supposedly sat up all night with Benny, breathing into his mouth to keep him alive. And there was some reason that he was particularly connected with Benny, and that would have had to be through Uncle Joe.
It may have been. Uncle Joe might have known him or had some contact with him.
As part of his sort of, jack of all trades abilities, was he involved in any way with the Shabbat dinner or any of the Jewish
No.
rituals? Was that kept completely separate from?
Didn't have anything to do with that. He came to be present when he was praying. He would, in early days, he would help him go to the synagogue and all that. But to my knowledge, there was no other connection. I mean, he was not there for dinner time. I'm sure that if he happened to be there, he was welcome to have dinner with
In the
whoever
kitchen.
was there. Right.
I mean,
But-
he wouldn't come to the table.
No.
He knew his place, even in those days, as close as he was.
As close as he was.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Mm.
That was
He
what
would
was-
have been, just looking at the age that he was, he would have had to have been born to
In
slaves.
slavery. Oh, surely he was.
So that he was older than I'm guessing.
Surely he was.
Yeah.
I know we have to wrap up, and I do want to give you each a chance to add any final thoughts, but I did want to just touch back briefly on something that you brought up, Uncle Ted, about one foot in the old world and one foot in the new, and sort of the transitional time. And certainly within our culture, Yiddish was the language spoken, and then over time, not. In your experience, how much Yiddish was spoken? Are there things that you particularly remember, phrases that you carried forward, and was it seen as something that should be sort of let go as we moved into the new world? Just speak a little bit about that part of the culture, the language.
Our parents both spoke Yiddish. My mother spoke Yiddish fluently and could write in Yiddish, as she did to Uncle Morris. I know because I saw the letters when she mailed them. But Yiddish was still important to them because a lot of the people that they would be mingled with did not know real English, if there's such a thing. They weren't conversant with English to express themselves. So they could more easily do that if they spoke Yiddish. But as my mother, for example, taught English at the Alliance, taught these young people who came over while she was working there to help them learn to participate. It worries me today about the children that I see in my work who are Hispanic children. And some of them have been living here for 4, 5, 6 years, and their parents still don't speak any English. And I think that's a disaster for these children because they're not being able to communicate with peers and with others. But that's why they continued doing it, was because they needed it. But then they did learn it. Uncle Morris, Uncle Irving, Uncle Joe, they all spoke English and they were conversant with the language. It was...
My father spoke English well, even had a flair, and he told jokes marvelously, but he didn't write English. A reason, it took me a long time to realize why he never wrote to me when I was in college. We spoke once a week, but when I went away, I would write, and I'd never get an answer from him, from a brief from my mother. And it was clearly the case that he was afraid he was going to make a mistake. He was going to spell something wrong, and he was rather proud. The only time I saw him write anything except for a pawn ticket in Uncle Morris's store, where I also wrote out pawn tickets, and in my father's store too, was in writing in Yiddish to Aunt Ida.
Well, I grew sorry, go ahead.
And that he felt comfortable. So the mastery of Yiddish was surely, the native sense of Yiddish was there. My mother only was speaking for herself when she said Yiddish is not really a language, it's only a slang. Yeah. Now that is a common misapprehension about Yiddish. It certainly is a language. Right. But it shows that she knew, she spoke in phrases and so forth, but not, she couldn't carry on a real conversation. She could understand anything. And this was a woman who played for Yiddish revues, Yiddish musicals. So she had to, and also sang Yiddish lullabies to me. So she had to be, she had to know what these people were singing on the stage.
I grew up in a very wonderful Jewish family in Washington. It was very devoted to Judaism and very charitable family. We didn't have any money. We didn't know we were poor. We were very happy. I was a depression baby. I was a depression baby. And my mother was born in Washington, and my father was born in New York City. He came there when he was he was born in New York City. So it was my grandparents, of course, who came from parts of Russia, in Poland. And and they spoke Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish was spoken. My mother spoke Yiddish. They all spoke Yiddish, but they never spoke it. If they wanted to say something and they didn't want us to hear it, they would speak in Yiddish, you know.
That's
You know.
just
common.
But they never really,
Very.
they never really tried to, which I regret to this day, they never tried to bring us into the language so that we would really understand and be able to speak it, because it's something you can travel any place in the world today, in any Jewish community where old Jewish people live, and the only way you really can communicate with them, I remember in these beautiful synagogue in Leningrad in those days, and the only way Marvin could speak to the dissidents was to speak Yiddish to the older people. It was a common thread language that you could communicate with them. Until this day, it's still the same thing. So it's a wonderful language, and I regret that I never knew it.
I remember talking about our parents, both of whom spoke English without accent.
That's right.
And, but they did speak Yiddish fluently. And they would have their arguments with each other in Yiddish, not
I
in
wish my
English.
parents had.
And I always thought that was interesting. The other thing is, that, as you say, Yiddish was and still is to a certain extent a universal language. First of all, somebody made reference to Thomas, carried around a newspaper, De Forwitz.
Yeah.
The Forwitz, which today is still published as an English newspaper, was the source of information for the European Jews who had arrived in this country and spoke English primarily. And this Jewish newspaper was their means of communication. In addition to that, the idea, and this was reflected somewhat by what your mother said, it was again part of this idea that we wanted to leave Europe behind.
Absolutely.
There weren't really good memories associated with being in Europe, and we now are American and in America. And that's where a lot of the reasons that people didn't want to teach their children Yiddish came from. And whether it was jargon or it was a very rich literature, as you all know, but they wanted to say, we're leaving Europe behind.
That's what my grandparents did. My grandparents only talked Yiddish when they were something about us kids, and we couldn't catch it. Little by little, I picked up certain words, and I would say back to them those, and they'd say, no, that wasn't it. It was it, but they didn't want us to know it.
Something
I
the
mean,
family
yes.
missed was a secular intellectual Yiddish life. And it's in secular Yiddish life that the literature flourished. And that you really needed a big Jewish population in New York. Probably it would happen in Philadelphia,
Right.
some in Chicago.
You're
But
right.
that's
Yeah.
where the writing happened and where the language was maintained in a full conversational cultural form.
I need to ask you a question about something you said earlier about your mother in talking about Minnie, Uncle Joe's first wife, and the phrase you said that she's a
beautiful girl.
beautiful girl, and that meant something to your mother, that there had been a tragedy of some
That's
kind.
right.
Do you think that, because we haven't even mentioned this, was that associated with Ida Mae's deformity?
Well, I think something has. I think Ida Mae is a very important figure in this, and it's hard to know really what to say about it. But I know that she attributed
Yeah,
that tragedy
yeah,
to this other beautiful girl.
yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Well, because my mother was very close to Ida Mae, again, as looking upon her as a child without anybody to take care of her. And Ida Mae was the most independent woman that you can possibly imagine. She was, after she was the principal at the school, she became Rabbi Epstein's secretary and ran in essence, the workings of the congregation for many years. And then she did civil service work and other things. She got into that. And then out of the blue, apparently, Ida Mae moves to Washington. I thought my mother would have a coronary. That what is she going to do by herself? Who does she know in Washington? She had a big job in civil service there, and there happens to be a picture that I think will be shown tonight. I went to visit her. Why? I was in the Navy. I was in Maryland, and my mother says, "You ought to go see Ida Mae." She didn't exactly say ought to go. She said, "You must go see Ida Mae."
Whatever she said, that's what she said.
That's right. And I did, and I spent a day with her, and we took a picture, a little snapshot. It was no bigger than this. It's the only picture that I have of her, and I gave it to Michael to include in whatever he's going to show this evening. But this was another situation of an independence came from somewhere in the family. I'd like to think that it did. A gene of some type kicked in and let this woman have a life of her own. Nobody ever heard her cry that I know of. Nobody ever heard her complain about anything. And goodness knows.
No, it's the laughs, the smile.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
being on
big
the
smile.
outside and looking in through your eyes about this this beautiful, wonderful family that we're talking about from the very beginning. And it's such a diversified group of people, all with that has certainly influenced this family. I mean, it just influenced the family because it's become so meaningful in your own lives. And I think as we grow older even, we realize and can look back and even pass judgment on it even more so, Stanley, about how important it was.
It is.
It really is. And
It's a permanent.
and I think that to have this reunion and to have your children and the older grandchildren to be able to be here and to have a glimpse of what's happening and how it can influence them, it's just the most marvelous thing that you all have done.